So week in and week out, the prisoners of the plague struggled along the best they could. As we have seen, a few like Rambert have even managed to imagine that they were acting as free men, and that they could still choose. But in reality, one could say that at the moment, in the middle of August, that the plague had covered everything. There were no longer any individual destinies, but a collective history that was the plague, and the feelings shared by all. The greatest of these feelings of separation and exile. With all the involved fear and rebellion, this is why the narrator feels it's appropriate, at a high point of heat and sickness, to describe the general situation and the sake of examples, the violence of our living fellow citizens, the brutal of dead and suffering of parted lovers. It was the middle of the year, and the wind rose and the blew from the several days the plague rid town. The inhabitants of Iran particularly dread the wind because it encounters the natural obscure of the plateau, and the town lies on the consequently sweep along the streets in full force. After a long month in which not a drop of water had refreshed the town, it was covered by a great coating which peeled off, and the wind blew it on it, and the way it raised the clouds of dust and papers, and wrapped around legs and what had become rare passerbys. One saw the hesitant down the street and bent forward with a handkerchief, the hands across the mouth. In the evening, instead of the gathering in which people tried to prolong contrast to the far possible as these days, each of which could be the last, one met small groups of people hurrying to return home or get into cafes. So much so that for some days the dusk, which fell much faster at this time of the year, the streets were deserted and only the wind mourned continuously down them. A smell of seaweed and the salt rose from the wind-tossed, always invisible sea. The empty town, white with dust, startled the sea smell. Loud with the howl of winds, would groan such times like the islands of the damned. Up till now the plague had claimed many victims in the outlying districts, which was more crowded and less affluent, the center of town, but suddenly it seemed to be getting closer and take up the resistance in the business quarters as well. The inhabitants accused the wind of carrying the sea of infection. It's a suffering the cards, said the manager of the hotel, which was the case. The town center leaned and turned. In the corner of the people heard the increased frequency of the night, throbbing ambulance sounds and the dreary, passionless calls of the plagued brethren of the windows. Inside the town, someone had the idea of quarantining certain districts, which had been especially hit hard. The only allowing people those service is the indispensable to leave them. Those who had lived there until that time were bound to consider the measures the form of victimization particularly directed against them. In any case, they considered the inhabitants of this area to be free men. Meanwhile, people from those other areas found them consolation in hard times with ideas that they were still less free than themselves. "There's always someone more captive than I am," was a statement that summed up the only possible hope at the time. In rough as this same period, there was an increased number of fires, especially in the leisure districts around the west gates of the town. Investigation showed that these were due to people who had come back from quarantine and, driven mad with grief and misfortune, set light to their houses under the illusion that this would kill the plague. It was very hard to fight these endeavors, which was frequent enough to put the whole district in permanent danger because the violence of the winds, after it had been demonstrated to no avail, disinfection the house by the authorities was enough to protect them against any of the contamination, and become necessary to impose a harsh penalties on those inconvenient pyromaniacs. It was apparently not the idea of the prison itself, but the disstaged and unfortunates. But the idea that they shared with everyone else, namely the prison term and the equivalent of the death sentence, because it was very high mortality rate found in the municipal jail. Of course, the belief was not without foundation. For obvious reasons, the plague seemed to fasten particularly on those who had become accustomed to living in groups: soldiers, members of religion orders, or prisoners. Despite the isolation of some inmates, the prison is a community, and what proves this is the fact that in our Muscopio prison, the wards is likely as the prison to the scum of the disease. From the higher point of view adapted by the plague, everyone from the prison, governed by the least of inmates, was contaminated, and perhaps for the first time absolute justice reigned inside the jail. The authorities tried in vain to introduce a hierarchy into the leveling and the idea of decorating prison wards who had died carrying on their duties. As the state of siege declared it from some point of view, it might be said that prison wards were the very active service. They were awarded a military medal of posthumously. Yet, while the prison raised no objection, the military reacted badly and correctly pointed out that the unfortunate confusion might arise in the public mind. The objection was accepted, and I decided the simplest thing was to give the ward who died the medal of epidemic. But in the case of the first among them, the harm had been done, and there could be no question of taking away the decoration. Though the military authorities continued to press on this point of view, in any case, as far as the epidemic medal was concerned, it was a disadvantage for not producing the effect of the morale, and the resulted in the award of the military decoration, since it was quite routine to get such decoration in the event of an epidemic, so no one was happy. Moreover, the prison authorities, who could not act the same way as the religious and the less extant military authorities, the monk from only 2 convents in the town had disappeared and housed previously in the previous families. In some way, whatever possible small groups of men had taken over the barracks and belittled on the schools and public buildings. In this way, the disease, which had apparently brought the inhabitants of Oran together in solidarity of people under siege, the same time broke up the traditional association that drove individuals back to the solitude. There was dismay. As you might imagine, all circumstances together, with the wind, inflamed the people's minds. Again, the gates of the town were rapidly attacked at night, but this time in small armed groups. There were exchanges of fire and few wounds and some escapes. The sanitary post was reinforced, and such quite quickly ceased, and they were enough, however, to raise the breath and revolt in the town, which led to some senses of violence. Houses had been set on fire to shut out for health reasons, and they were pillaged. In fact, it was hard to believe that such actions were permitted. Most often, some opportunities would lead heteros, honest citizens, to reprehend actions, which was promptly intimidated. So it might happen that some maniacs would dash into the still burning houses, right in front of the owners, who would daze in distress, seeing as he did nothing. Several onlookers would follow the example. The first vandals were set the light of fire in the dark side streets. Silhouettes could be seen in all directions, deforming by the dying flames and by objects of the furniture and they carried on their shoulders. It was these indicants that forced the authorities to compare the plague to a state of siege that applied the appropriate laws. 2 thieves were shot, but it was doubtful whether they made such impressions on the rest, since the mist was so much death that 2 executions passed unnoticed. There were a drop in the ocean, and the truth was similar to the event that occurred quite frequently without the authorities giving any sign of invitation. The only measure that seemed to impress all the inhabitants was the imposition of curfew. After 11 o'clock, plunged into darkness, the town was like a monument. Under the moonlit sky, in the wished wall of the regular streets extended the straight lines never broken by the black shape of the trees, never disturbed by the steps of the passersby or the low howl of dogs. The silent town was henceforth the heaped mass of motionless cubes between the mute and the statue, and forgotten benefactors or farmed great men, stiffened and even in bronze, were left alone trying with their imitation faces in stone and iron to suggest a degree of image of what the man used to be. These mediocre idiots resigned beneath the heavy skies of the lifeless coward roads. Unfleeting brutes who invoked rather well that they stayed the immortality into which we had drafted, or at least the final state of this necropolis in which plague, stone, and the night had finally silenced every voice. By night it was also every heart and facts were well in the mist, and were passed around the brutes were not likely to reassure our fellow citizens. It really is necessary to speak about Brutals, and the narrator apologized in the fact. He was still aware that circumstances might level against him in the respect, and his only justification is that the brutal thought throughout the time, and that since he was forced, like all other people in town, to concern himself with that. It was not that he had any kind of taste for ceremony, and the contrary, he prefers the company of living, and that if you want an example like sea bathing, but the fact that sea bathing had been forbidden the company of the living was in contrast to the fear of being obliged to give way to the dead. It was obvious, of course, one could always try not see one covered eyes and reject the obvious, but it was terrible force that eventually carried all before it. For example, how can you avoid Brutals when the day comes when someone you love has need for one? Well, the main fear of the cemeteries was the start of the speed. All the formalities was simplified, and the general fruity prompt and the circumstances were discarded. Victims dead far from the families, and the ritual watched over the dead and were banned. So the person who died in the evening passed the night alone, and the ones who died in the day were buried quickly as possible. Of course, the family was informed, but in most cases its members could not attend. Since they were in quarantine, if they had been living with a sick person, in case they were the family and not yet lived with the deceased, they would arrive at the appointed time of the departure towards the cemetery. The corpses have already been laid out and put in the coffin. Suppose this formality had been taken as a luxury hospital. Dr. Ryu was in charge, and the school had an exit sited behind the main building, and there were coffins and large box rooms in the corridor. In the corridor itself, the families discovered a single coffin already closed. Immediately they got on with the most important task, which was to have the same document signed by the head of the family. After that, the coffin was loaded in the motor vehicle. It was either a proper hearsay or a large ambulance appropriately modified. The relatives got into one of the taxis, still allowed to operate the cars headed to the cemetery at full speed, taking the route to avoid the town center. At the gates, the convoy halted, and the gendarmes were stamped the official pass, without which was impossible to have the town folks called a last home. The guards stepped back, and the car pulled up beside the square, and a number of graves are waiting to be filled. A priest met the party because the funeral service in church had been banned. The coffin was brought out to the company, the prayer and ropes, and placed around it, and dragged along, slipped, hit the bottom of the grave, and the priest shook the holy water over it, and already the first clods of earth were crushing against the lid. The ambulance had left a short time before they washed down the disinfectants, and while the shovelfuls of clay gave off an increasingly dull sound, the family piled back into the taxi. A quarter of an hour later, they were back home. In this way, everything really happened the greatest speed and the minimum risk. Needless to say, at least at the start, it was clear that the natural feelings of relatives were softened. But in time of these plagues, it was a consideration that cannot concern us. Everything was sacrificed in efficiency. Moreover, while the start of the morale of the people was affected by such practices, because the desire to decently bury was more widespread than you might think. Luckily, after a short while, there was an urgent problem for food supplies, and this attention was turned towards more immediate concerns. Taken up with quicking, pulling strings, and filling forms, if they wanted to eat, people did not have the time to worry about how others were dying around them, or how they themselves would one day die. So these maternal difficulties seemed to be affliction that would eventually be seen to have been a boon. And when all the best of the best, if the epidemic had not spread as it would have seen. For coffins that were starting to be in a short supply, there were not enough cloths to shroud the space of the cemetery. Something had to be done. The simplest thing, still for reason of efficiency, seemed to be group funerals together, and when necessary to increase the number of journals between the hospital and the cemetery. So as far as Rayu Hospital was concerned, they had 5 coffins for the time being. Once these were full, the ambulance loaded them, and the cemetery and the coffins were emptied. The corpses, gray as iron, were loaded on stretchers and waited for specialty plunge hangers. The coffins were sprayed with antiseptic solution and taken back to the hospital. When the progress began again, it was often necessary the whole thing was well organized and perfect, except for expressed his satisfaction. And he even told Ryu that all was said and done, it was preferable to hearsay drive the black slaves, which one read about in the chronicles of the earlier plagues. Yes, Ryu said, the burials is the same, but we keep the card index. No one can deny that we have made progress. Despite the success for the authorities, the unpleasant character of the formalities had now taken force of the prefecture to keep relatives away from the cemetery, and allow them to come to the gate of the cemetery through, even though it was not official because there were funerality riots and concerned things to change a bit. As far in the cemetery, the featureless area covered the mystic trees. 2 hung pits had been dug, and the men's grave and the woman's grave. From this point of view, the authorities respected the conversation, and that it was only later, when they forced the circumstances case, that the veil of modesty disappeared and the men and women were buried haphazardly, one on top of the other, and through the decency, luckily the extreme confusion affected only by the final moments of the pestilence. At this time, what concerns us now is the separation of pits. The authorities were very keen on it. The bottom of each, their thick laid of quicklime smoke and boiled, while around the edges the whole small mounds of some chemical bulbs up in the air, and while the ambulance had completely their journey, the stretchers were brought in procession, and naked, slightly twisted corpses were allowed to split at the bottom, more or less side by side. After that, they were covered in quicklime at each, and then the earth, and only on top of a certain height, in order to leave room for the more occupants to come. The following day, the relatives were invited to sign and register, which was to show the difference that there may be between men and, for example, dogs. You keep check of human beings. For these operations needed staff and the manpower, and always on the verge of running out. Many male nurses and grave diggers who were first official and casuals dead of the plague. Whatever precautions were taken on the day of infection occurred. Though you think about it, the most surprising thing was that there was never a shortage of men to do the job. For as long as the epidemic lasted, the critical period occurred shortly before the plague reached its peak. Then Dr. Ryu's fears were founded. There were not enough people either for supervision or for what he called heavy work. But from the time when the plague really took hold of the town, it was very in proportion, had one quite convenient outcome, because it distributed the whole economic life, that created quite a large number of unemployed. In most cases, they did not supply supervisors. For when it came to dirty work, recruitment became much easier as a result. Indeed, from the first time onward, poverty always triumphed over fear, to the extent that work was always paid according to risk involved. The health service was able to draw up a list of those seeking work, and as soon as the vacancy occurred, the first on the list was informed, and assuming that they had not yet gone vacant themselves in the meantime, did not fail to turn up. In this way, the prefect, who had long refused to make up his mind about employing the contaminated to death or life for the first kind of work, was unable to avoid having to recourse to them. As long as they were men unemployed, he considered such a decision could wait.